I'm willing to take the hit. I'm Daniel Natal, so that you don't have to be. Herbert Spencer's book, Study of Sociology, was groundbreaking in 1873 because he laid the groundwork for a systematic study of how society is governed by different institutions. For instance, government is just one institution. Religion is another, academia is another, media is another, and so forth. All of these institutions have a different relationship with the people. The problem arises when you try to substitute one institution for another. For instance, when the government starts acting as if it were a religion. In the 1500s, Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce, but the Catholic Church didn't allow divorce. His solution was to kick them out and set up his own sect of Christianity, Anglicanism. Henry declared himself to be not just the head of the government, but also of the church. Where institutional bleed-over got messy was when, in the vacuum created by the Catholic Church, the government started taking over some of those functions. For instance, it used to be the church that fed the poor and engaged in charity work. After the Catholic Church was banished, the government had to step in, and the poor laws were enacted. Basically a social welfare system run not by the church, but by the state for the first time. Because of this switcheroo, a certain segment of the society started to apply the dogmatism and loyalty that they'd once had for the church to the government. It became a de facto religion for them. They saw corrupt politicians as altruistic angels now, conferring upon them the prejudice that they had once only reserved for the clergy. Today, we have another institution stealing power from a pre-existing one, namely, corporations taking over the functions of governments. This habit of one institution poaching in the domain of another and trying to carry out its mission is like trying to use a hammer for a job that requires a screwdriver. It's not done well. The government, for instance, didn't do very well in its masquerade as a religion. Corporations don't actually administer the state competently when they set themselves up as a shadow government. Incompetence reigns because these institutions succumb to mission creep after forgetting their telos. Just as a reminder, a telos is the Greek word for an end goal for a thing. Aristotle says that government, for instance, has a telos. It's responsible for three basic things. He says that, number one, creating infrastructure is one of their duties. 2, establishing a judiciary. And 3, maintaining a military. The telos of a government is not to look after the healthcare of the populace. That would be the telos of a hospital. The telos of a government is not supposed to be about banning alcohol. It's not supposed to be about setting up a new religion or doing charity work. Once a government forgets its underlying purpose, incompetence sets in and collapse is assured. When the financial class, led by Bernard Baruch, approached Herbert Hoover with what would later be called the New Deal, Hoover was mortified. Baruch was the architect of a plan to radically change the nature of government and expand the bureaucracy. He wanted to create 75 new agencies to control 75 aspects of the economy. For instance, he wanted a Department of Agriculture to control food, a department called NIST to control the field of engineering, a Department of Energy to control oil, etc. You get the point. 75 new departments to control every aspect of the economy, whereupon Herbert Hoover pointed out that these reforms were what Mussolini had done in Italy. Baruch was fully aware of this, since he had financed Mussolini. Hoover said, "The Constitution grants me no such power to control the economy. What you're describing is Mussolini's fascism." In his autobiography, Hoover wrote, "I tried to show him that this stuff was pure fascism, that it was merely a remaking of Mussolini's corporate state, and refused to agree to any of it. He informed me that in view of my attitude, the business world would support Roosevelt with money and influence. That, for the most part, proved true." So what you had was a radical restructuring of the government away from its actual telos of paving roads, having a court system, and maintaining a military, and making the government responsible for manipulating the economy. Once again, using a hammer for a job that required a screwdriver. Conservative theoretician James Burnham, in his 1941 book, The Managerial Revolution, talks about how in a totalitarian state, you have one technocratic system that isn't content to control just one institution, namely the government, but to control all of the other institutions in the society as well.
Chapter 11. Totalitarianism and Managerial Society. Those nations, Russia, Germany, and Italy, which have advanced furthest towards a managerial social structure, are all of them, at present, totalitarian dictatorships. Though there have been many dictatorships in the past, none of them, in a complex culture at any rate, has been so extreme in form as totalitarianism. Others have been as severe within the limited realms of social life to which the dictatorship extended. But what distinguishes totalitarian dictatorship is the number of facets of life subject to the impact of dictatorial rule. We already know, without speculating about the future, that this is what is happening today. But when the transition is accomplished, the situation changes. The new institutions and ideologies will be consolidated on an at least semi-stable basis. Control by the ruling class can be assured. When major social institutions upholding the position of the ruling class are firmly consolidated, when ideologies contributing to the maintenance of these institutions are generally accepted, when the instruments of education and propaganda are primarily available to the ruling class, and so on. All major parts of the economy will be planned and controlled by the single integrated set of institutions, which will be the managerial state.
Notice how he kept referring to a single set of integrated institutions in the technocracy that he calls the managerial state. That's the difference between a dictatorship and a totalitarian state. A dictator is just in charge of one institution, the government. In a totalitarian state, by contrast, the technocrats lay claim to controlling the government, the economy, the educational system, media, art, marriage, and every other institution in a complex society. The ambition of totalitarians is of much larger scope than that of a mere dictator. In the past, we were used to the left asserting that they wanted a separation of church and state. Today, they react to the state as the church. What's chilling is how the subjects inside a totalitarian system come to regard the state as a religion, and obedience and dogmatism follow suit. Clinical psychologist Matthias Desmet made the news recently when he talked about this phenomenon in what he calls mass formation psychosis, and how this is the ruling ideology of a totalitarian state. Here's James Corbett interviewing him.
I think before we dive into this question of mass formation and how to cope with it, or how to deal with it, or how to derail this agenda, or whatever way we want to frame that, as usual, I think we have to start by defining some of these terms, because, as I say, I'm sure everyone has heard something about this over the past several months, but probably not in any degree of detail, or not like what you've painted in the book. And I would suggest that perhaps the easiest way to begin broaching this conversation is from the introduction to your book, where you noted that dictatorships are based on a primitive psychological mechanism, namely on the creation of a climate of fear amongst the population based on the brutal potential of the dictatorial regime. Totalitarianism, on the other hand, has its roots in the insidious psychological process of mass formation. And you go on to say that mass formation is, in essence, a kind of group hypnosis that destroys individuals' ethical self-awareness and robs them of their ability to think critically. All right, so I'm getting the impression from this is some sort of psychological social phenomenon, but perhaps you can expand on that. How would you frame mass formation for people who've never heard that term before?
Yes, it's indeed crucial to understand what mass formation is if you want to understand the essence of totalitarianism. But as you said, as you just quoted from the book, people often mix up classical dictatorship with totalitarianism. And it's as I think you're witnessing now, the emergence of a new kind of totalitarianism, not the fascist or not the communist totalitarianism, but the technocratic totalitarianism, which is at the same time similar and different from fascist and communist totalitarianism. But as I think we witness the emergence of a new totalitarianism now, I think it's really crucial to understand what mass formation is and to be aware of how a totalitarian state emerges in a society. And as you mentioned already, a mass formation is a typical kind of group formation, which has a very specific characteristic impact on individual mental functioning. One of the most remarkable effects of mass formation on individual psychological functioning is that it makes people radically incapable of taking a critical distance from what the group believes in. So once people are in the grip of this process of mass formation, they will typically become blind for the absurd characteristics of the groupthink, of what the group believes in. And this goes quite far. The people who are in the grip of mass formation can truly believe the most absurd things, even if it concerns people who are usually highly intelligent and highly educated. That's something very characteristic. We could even say that historical examples show that the higher the level of education, the more vulnerable people are for mass formation.
Toward the end, he reminded me of Mark Penn's book, Microtrends Squared. In it, he has a chapter called The Impressionable Elites, whereby he documents studies that demonstrate that an inverse relationship exists between critical thinking faculties and the amount of time someone spends in a university. That is to say, that people who went to trade schools have better developed critical thinking faculties than someone who earned a degree in a university. It gets even worse as the degrees get higher. The more time spent inside an institution of higher learning, the less one can think rationally, and rather relies on appeals to authority for everything. As Noam Chomsky said, universities are not selection mechanisms for intelligence, but for conformity.
I quoted the Trilateral Commission view of the educational system, namely it's a system of indoctrination of the young. And I think that's correct. It's a system of indoctrination of the young. That was the way the liberal elites regard it, and they're more or less accurate. So the educational system is supposed to train people to be obedient, conformist, not think too much, do what you're told, stay passive, don't cause any crises of democracy, don't raise any questions, and so on. That's basically what the system is about. Even the fact that the system has a lot of stupidity in it, I think, has a function. You know, it means that people are filtered out for obedience. If you can guarantee lots of stupidity in the educational system, you know, like stupid assignments and things like that, you know that the only people who make it through are people like me and like most of you, I guess, who are willing to do it no matter how stupid it is, because we want to go to the next step, you know. So you may know that this assignment is idiotic and the guy up there couldn't think his way out of a paper bag, but you'll do it anyway because that's the way you get to the next class, and you want to make it, and so on and so forth. Well, there are people who don't do that, you know. There are people who say, I'm not going to do it, it's too ridiculous, you know. Those people are called behavioral problems, or something like that. They end up in the principal's office or in the streets or selling drugs or whatever. And all of this is a technique for selection for obedience. And I don't know how to prove this, but I have a feeling that when you go to the elite universities, you find more obedience and conformity, probably because you're getting the students who were better able to do it, you know.
The answer, of course, is that academia is part of the aforementioned integrated set of institutions that are a central figure of a totalitarian state. Universities are no longer independent. Their job is not to educate people, but to create foot soldiers for the technocracy, obedient, conformist, low-resolution thinkers who hate liberty, free speech, and original thought. Until we can reclaim our institutions and separate them back out again, we're going to keep being forced to use a hammer for a screwdriver, and the people running things will keep confusing a DMV office for a church, a man for a woman, a country for an open-air prison. Our freedoms are under attack, yet the loss of freedom is not inevitable. America can be saved, and an informed citizenry can and will make the difference. Join us weekly for episodes of Beyond the Cover, and check out our print magazine too at thenewamerican.com.